Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out and spending your evening with us. My name is Ryan. I'm a recent member of Nodutdol. And we are really happy to have this opportunity to talk about an issue that's very dear to the members of Nodutdol. Nodutdol, for those who don't know, is a progressive organization made up of members of the Korean diaspora in America and allies. And one of the core beliefs of all the members of Nodutdol is the peaceful reunification of the Korean peninsula. And so we put together this teach-in not as experts in policy or as experts in history, but really as people who are engaged in community and activists who are presenting our particular viewpoint onto the current peace talks and issues in the Korean peninsula. And I just want to name that there are a lot of current and former members of Nodutdol in the audience, people who are experts in their own right. And then there are maybe people in the audience who are fairly new to these issues and topics. So all viewpoints and experiences are welcome. And we're really happy to have everyone here. And we'll also have a chance later in the evening to do some co-teaching, right? Because this is a teach-in. So you'll get an opportunity to learn from each other. Today, of course, marks the 65th anniversary of the signing of the Korean armistice in July 27th, 1953. Now, the armistice brought a halt to the Korean War, but as we know, in October of 1953, the US and the Republic of Korea, South Korea, entered a mutual defense agreement, breaking the armistice. And to date, there's been no official peace treaty signed between North and South Korea. So the Korean War is technically ongoing. It is an ongoing conflict. The US, of course, still has something like 30,000 troops stationed in South Korea. And so this history, the history of the quote-unquote forgotten war, as it's called in America, the Korean War, is really the crucial backdrop to everything that we'll be discussing tonight. And historical context is very important to Nodutdol in terms of making sense of these current issues. 5 years ago, members of this group and other allies marched on the White House saying 60 years since the armistice was long enough and that it was time to sign a peace treaty. 5 years later, a lot of us were dismayed to hear last year talks of a possible nuclear war. There was some very alarming and disconcerting talk happening from the White House. And so a lot of us, I think, were very gratified and interested and hopeful, tentatively, to see the developments this year. The cooperation between the North and South at the Pyeongchang Olympics. Of course, the historic summit in April between President Moon of South Korea and Kim Jong-un of North Korea. And of course, the historic summit in June between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, which was the first time a US president has met with the leader of North Korea since the Korean War. So what we're going to do this evening is present, we have 3 volunteers, Betsy representing North Korea, Yujin representing South Korea, and Rose, who will be discussing the US. So this triangle, right, of politics that we're very much engaged in. So we'll have a series of questions that our presenters will speak to. We'll have a question and response with the audience, and then we'll have some breakout groups where we really want everyone here to engage in and talk about their own interests and connection to these issues, what we can do as activists collectively. Does that sound good to everyone? Okay, great. So the first question that we're going to start off with is, why is this such a critical moment for these respective countries from these different standpoints? What is particular about this political situation now?
Okay, so I'm going to talk about North Korea, as Ryan said. So in terms of discussing why this is a critical moment for North Korea, I'm going to discuss 2 aspects. One is, why is this critical for US-North Korea relations, and why is this critical for North Korea itself? In terms of US-NK relations, as Ryan mentioned, it's the first time the 2 leaders have met since the Korean War. And another aspect is that because of North Korea's status as a nuclear state, this heightens the stakes for both countries if peace fails or if war breaks out. Whereas before, I think the US might have seen itself as not as vulnerable as North Korea. which is not, anyway. And then it's also an opportunity in terms of US-NK relations for the US to go against precedent and actually follow through on commitments it makes to the United States in any of its agreements. I'll go into that in a later question. And as for North Korea itself, North Korea is now a nuclear state, and the implications for this is that they have more leverage in negotiations than they did in their previous negotiations with the United States. In addition, the status quo for North Korea is a heightened state of war in an environment of economic sanctions, war games, and happening just below the 38th parallel. War games, for those you might not know, is what the US media calls military exercises. They're very provocative, and they practice military scenarios that include nuclear attack on North Korea and various other scenarios that are very threatening to North Korea. So if nothing at all happens and the status quo continues, North Korea's situation is still a difficult situation that it's not ideal for them. And then finally, the US's demand for North Korea's denuclearization opens the door to removing US nuclear apparatus that they have in South Korea right now. For example, the military base in Gangjang or the THAAD in Seongju, which will be discussed more later. Yeah.
I'm going to check if this works. Okay, I'll just good. I'll speak about two reasons why this is the most critical moment for South Korea. The first reason is about family separations and the possibility of reunification. Oh, sorry. Can you guys all hear me now? Yeah. Okay. I'm not used to speaking with a mic, so. Koreans who've been separated from their families by the war and the border are getting older, and many Koreans from the north and south and of the diaspora have not been able to see family members since the beginning of the Korean War. There are over 130,000 South Koreans who registered to be reunited with family in the north, and sadly over 50% of this number have passed away. So the youngest of those who've been separated from their family are now elderly. And we're running out of time to reunite these families. That's the first reason why it's a critical moment. The second reason that this is a critical moment for South Korea is that Moon Jae-in is in power. His administration came directly out of the Candlelight Revolution. And if you don't know, that's a series of massive protests that took place in South Korea between November of 2016 and March of 2017, which led to the eventual impeachment and imprisonment of then President Park Geun-hye. Elections were held, and then President Moon Jae-in was elected by the people. And because this administration, the current administration, was brought to power by this massive people's movement, there is enormous pressure on him to bring about change, as in bringing more transparency to political affairs, rooting out corruption within the government itself. And there's also a lot of expectation on him to improve relations with North Korea. Before his election, South Korea endured 9 years of deteriorating relations with the North under two successive conservative presidents. And the previous efforts to warm relations between the South and the North were basically undone during this period of time. Most South Koreans want to resume inter-Korean dialogue, inter-Korean dialogue, that had been abandoned by the previous two administrations. And Moon has an 80% approval rating coming out of this most recent inter-Korean summit. And that's really his chance now to bring peace to the peninsula. This is why it's a critical moment from the South Korean perspective. And if we know anything from history, it could take a long time before we have another opportunity like this.
Okay, as far as why this is a critical moment for the U.S., there are several points. First, with last year's ICBM test, the U.S. has finally recognized that North Korea has an effective nuclear deterrent, and that a preemptive strike against North Korea could have devastating consequences for the U.S. So increasingly, the military option is less of an option. Second, with the U.S.'s ongoing imperialist occupations in the Middle East, the U.S. can't afford to initiate another war in East Asia. They've been having trouble withdrawing troops from Iraq and Afghanistan over the last decade, and they're also locked in conflicts in Syria and also with Iran. And finally, if the Trump regime wants to contain China, as it appears to be with the appointment of John Bolton as National Security Advisor and with the recent trade wars, the U.S. will want to focus its attention on China instead of North Korea or the Korean Peninsula.
Okay, thank you, Rose. So given this historical context and given what we're facing in the current situation, what are the stakes for each government? What are the win-loss scenarios? Why does this matter? What's pressing on each government to make these decisions right now?
So for North Korea, North Korea's survival as a state is at stake. I will go into this later, but the government-people distinction that we use to describe like U.S. people and U.S. government is not as applicable. They have a different social structure. A collapse of the North Korean state would be disastrous, not only for the people that its collapse is would be purported to save, but also for South Korea and for China. So what's at stake is either war or status quo are the two options. Again, as I said earlier, in the event of war, there would be a devastating loss of life. During the Korean War, an estimated quarter to 1/3 of North Koreans were killed, and the U.S. dropped 32,000 tons of napalm on North Korea, basically leveling the country. In addition, economic sanctions are a form of warfare, and as we saw with Iraq, during the Clinton era, can lead to an appalling loss of life. Even if war does not break out, again, continuation of the status quo is a state of heightened military conflict and necessitates the channeling of funds towards building up their military defenses rather than focusing on social infrastructure. Another thing that's at stake for North Korea in its negotiations is the question of whether the U.S. will follow through on the agreements it makes. Brief history, so I'm going to go through the Clinton, Bush, and Obama years really quickly. In '94, Clinton negotiated the agreed framework with North Korea, which was a freeze of 8 years on plutonium production. And then in 2000, the U.S. was supposed to buy all of North Korea's buy all of North Korea's medium and long-range missiles. They signed a mutual non-aggression treaty. However, the U.S. did not follow through with many of its commitments because, as some of you may know, the arduous march happened, and many policymakers in the U.S. believed that the state was on the brink of collapse, and that therefore they were hoping that would happen so they wouldn't have to follow through on the commitments that they made. Bush dropped all previous agreements, announced a preemptive strike strategy, and put North Korea in the axis of evil. Near the end of his term, there were six-party talks. North Korea blew up its cooling tower in Yongbyon in 2007 as a gesture of good faith, while Bush removed North Korea from the axis of evil. However, in the talks that happened there, again, administrators were hoping for collapse. Obama put forth a strategy of strategic patience combined with what he called the pivot to Asia. Strategic patience basically means the status quo, which, as I mentioned earlier, is itself a form of warfare.
Is it working now? Okay, sorry. So from the South Korean perspective, and this is going to expand a little bit on what Betsy already said, the stakes are the Korean people. If there are war, The Atlantic reported last year that according to one Pentagon estimate, even without nuclear weapons being used, the first days of such a war would see fatalities of 20,000 per day. Defense Secretary James Mattis has warned that a conflict of this magnitude could be catastrophic and probably the worst kind of fighting in most people's lifetimes. Was that me? Last year, when tensions were high, Senator Lindsey Graham said, if there's going to be a war to stop Kim Jong-un, it will be over there. If thousands die, they're going to die over there. It's not going to be here. So acknowledging the scale of possible destruction and death, Graham's words belie just how the U.S. views the stakes in this. But from the South Korean view, there is actually here. It's Korean people, Korean livelihood, Korean well-being. And somewhere caught up in the tension between these two views is something that South Korea can gain from this peace process, and that's their sovereignty, the ability to control their own fates. So the U.S. currently holds something that's called wartime operational control. Operational control, in general, is the right to control military operations, and it's generally divided between wartime and peacetime command. And when the U.S. military first entered South Korea at the onset of the Korean War, General MacArthur was given command of the entire South Korean military. The U.S. military remained in South Korea ever since, as you may know, and only transferred peacetime operational control back to South Korea in 1994. U.S. generals continue to hold wartime operational control, which means that if there were a war today to break out on the peninsula, then a U.S. general by the name of Vincent Brooks would have command of the entire 5.8 million strong South Korean military force. However, even President Moon, who has had an appeasing approach towards the U.S. military, is pushing to gain South Korea's sovereignty. Last September, he declared his intention to retrieve South Korea's wartime operational control during an Armed Forces Day celebration. And the importance of Korea's sovereignty also appears in the peace declaration that came out this past spring. A phrase that appears in both this one and previous peace declarations is translated like this. South and North Korea affirm the principle of determining the destiny of the Korean nation on their own accord, which is 우리 민족끼리. With full sovereignty, South Korea will have the opportunity to more broadly question and redefine its long-standing bilateral alliance with the United States. The nature of this alliance is a military alliance, and so it is defined and given shape by the existence of a common enemy. That enemy position, which is occupied by North Korea, calls the alliance into existence. However, in order for this process, the peace process, to be effective, South Korea has to relinquish that position. South Korea must no longer see North Korea as an enemy. And if there's no longer an enemy, there's no reason for the alliance with the United States, as it is. Thus, for South Korea, it's time to think of forming new alliances, perhaps regional ones, that could be built around a new model. And I'm going to quickly add one more thing that is at stake from the South Korean point of view is Moon's legacy. President Moon, up to this point, hasn't really come through on many of his campaign promises. And if the peace process fails, there isn't much that he can claim as his achievements.
Okay, as for the U.S., the state of U.S. hegemony itself seems to be at stake. First, the military-industrial complex will lose enormously if peace develops. I don't know how many people are aware of this in the room, but in the last 5 years, South Korea has been second to Saudi Arabia in purchasing U.S. arms. Also, in the face of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the power and authority of the U.S. itself would diminish if North Korea is allowed to be a de facto nuclear state. Second, the legacy and the narrative of the Korean War seems to be at stake. Will the U.S. still be able to call the Korean War the Forgotten War? And it's interesting to consider how that title has served to obscure the violence that the U.S. government has committed against the Korean people for 70 years. Also at stake in the event of peace is the potential for developing new markets and trade with North Korea. And finally, for Donald Trump, what's at stake is his historical legacy and public perception. Clearly, ending the Korean War will appear as a success for his administration.
Great, thank you. Which brings us to what are the strategies these different governments are using to gain their wins? What is the approach of each of these governments to the peace talks?
Okay, I just wanted to add to Yujin's thing, the fact that operational control remains in the wartime operational control remains in the hands of the United States lends credence to the North Korean perspective of the Korean War as a war of American aggression against Korea. Notably, South Korea was not present at the armistice signing, and so a peace treaty ending the conflict would have to be between the United States and North Korea. Okay, so what is the North Korean government's approach? Its demands have remained consistent since the signing of the armistice in 1953. It wants peace. What would peace mean? Peace would be a non-aggression treaty with the United States. The implications for this has implications for the U.S.-South Korea military alliance, including end to war games and an end to the mutual defense treaty between South Korea and the United States. Peace also means an end to the Korean War and normalization of relations with the United States. This would include things like having an embassy and would allow for situations such as the Otto Warmbier situation or when the journalists were taken into custody by North Korea to be more easily resolved through diplomacy rather than through threats and fronting. And peace would also mean an end to sanctions. And another demand is Korean sovereignty over the reunification process, as Yujin said, 우리 민족끼리 between the Korean people. So North Korea's nuclear, and another aspect of North Korea's strategy is that their nuclear capability provides North Korea with more leverage to make these demands in the first place. If the U.S. had followed through with its commitments outlined in the agreed framework in '94, North Korea would likely not be a nuclear state today. Its pursuit of a nuclear strategy hasn't been for the sake of gaining nuclear status, but for leverage to achieve its demands. Another point is that North Korea is always presented in the U.S. media as devious and untrustworthy, but it has always been upfront with its stated intentions. Rose mentioned the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, and so as an example, rather than remaining in the NPT and covertly pursuing nuclearization, it withdrew formally from the NPT in 2003. In contrast, U.S. has been and is a continued member of the NPT, yet it had nuclear weapons hidden in South Korea from the end of the Korean War until 1994, where they tacitly, but not overtly, stated that they had removed all such weapons. Also, do folks here know who the 3 nuclear states are that have declared that they will not engage in preemptive strike? You can just shout out.
North Korea.
China, North Korea.
India.
Julian, you answered all the questions. So North Korea, China, and India are the only states that have declared that they will not engage in preemptive strike. All the other nuclear states, most notably the United States, all reserve the right to preemptively nuclear strike another state. That's it.
So in South Korea, the peace talks have been framed as one of President Moon's achievements. He's given himself the role of silent mediator, 조용한 중재자, between the North and the U.S., with the ultimate goal of bringing peace to the peninsula. While looking to sign a peace treaty and adhere to the Panmunjom Declaration, Moon announced the cancellation of several joint U.S. and ROK military exercises, including Ulchi Freedom Guardian, which is usually scheduled for August, and next year's Key Resolve and Full Eagle exercises. However, despite these positive steps taken towards de-escalating tensions with the North, the Moon administration has what can be described as a conflicted approach to the peace process. The South Korean government is not willing to risk its relationship with the U.S. so far, as it's not been critical of the U.S. as a nuclear power when speaking of denuclearization, and it's not been it's maintaining its status quo, in its dealings with the U.S. military. THAAD, which if you don't know is a missile defense and radar system with surveillance capability that was installed by the United States and the South Korean military in Seongju. There were ongoing daily protests for years from the local residents of Seongju against the THAAD installation, but it was installed. And there were also well-organized protests against the building of a new naval base in Jeju Island. Since Moon has come to power, his administration's done nothing to respond to the local residents' pleas for peace and justice. THAAD is operational. The naval base in Jeju has been built despite the protests, and despite that they had international support. And the naval base is even welcoming the U.S. naval forces and is going to host International Fleet Week, even though it was purported that the base was for the South Korean Navy. These two domestic issues show that the demands of the people are put behind the demands of the alliance between South Korea and the United States. And even when the Korean people's needs are aligned with the path to peace. There are more domestic issues that aren't being addressed by Moon's administration while the international peace process takes center stage, such as the divisive minimum wage debates in South Korea. There was another Sangyong auto worker suicide from the rehiring struggle, the Hyundai Metal Workers Union struggle against wage discrepancies, the teachers union is fighting for legitimacy, and slow employment creation, and so on. So it seems that the peace process takes priority over the many pressing issues of South Korean life.
As for how the U.S. government is approaching this moment, there seems to be a lack of consensus in Washington with various factions. There are the neoconservative hawks in the White House, such as John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, and Vice President Pence, who want denuclearization of North Korea before anything else. There are Democrats in Congress, such as Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, who oppose Trump and the White House politically, but essentially have the same demands as the neocons, hawks. That is, complete denuclearization of North Korea first. Meanwhile, Mike Pompeo and the team that has been leading the negotiations with North Korea have on occasion shown openness to reason and have alluded to the need for long-term phased-in denuclearization. Finally, there's a very small minority of Democrats, such as Ro Khanna in California, who sees talk and engagement with North Korea as necessary, who support a more incremental approach to denuclearization, and who understands the need to reevaluate U.S. military provocations, such as the joint military exercises with South Korea.
So how are these governments shaping the narratives back to their own people, right? What are the various media outlets of these nations doing to present the particular narratives of those nations? And what does the government want the people to believe in terms of what's happening with these peace talks?
So my answer will be very short. The state narrative in North Korea is pro-talks, pro-peace, pro-engagement. It is also very strongly pro-reunification and has a very strong narrative of Korea as one nation. Our Nodutdol runs these exposure programs. They're called the Korea Education Exposure Programs, in which we take Korean people in the Korean diaspora to North Korea or South Korea, depending on the year. And based on the trips that have gone to North Korea in the past, the participants have all remarked like the strong difference in the way in which the narrative of reunification is very prominent and prevalent in just general North Korean life. And I'll talk a little more about that later.
The reaction from the South Korean media about this peace process has been positive overall and very supportive of Moon's role in it. All the major newspapers published articles about how President Moon's approval rating soared 10% higher to 83% right after the historic Inter-Korea summit. There's been also a shift in the public opinion of Kim Jong-un. His image has gone from crazy rocket man to reasonable and savvy politician. Even his popularity has surged in polls in South Korea. There is criticism though, and criticism and skepticism of the talks mostly comes from the conservative media, which isn't a surprise because the conservative media have historically been antagonistic towards North Korea. But even they have been coming around to the idea of peace. They see neoliberal corporate gains in the idea of reunification, such as the possibility of a new market opening up in North Korea, more consumers, access to their abundant natural resources, and a labor force to be tapped. And this is a quote from Lee Jung-seok, lead researcher at Sejong Research Institute. North Korean labor is just like South Korean labor without unions. Yeah. Speaking of South Korean unions, the conservatism of the mainstream media outlets in South Korea is being challenged internally. Encouraged by Moon's election, the unionized staff of two of the biggest news organizations, NBC and KBS, they went on strike to demand editorial independence and to demand the ouster of conservative appointed leadership. The two previous conservative administrations, the ones of Lee Myung-pak and Park Geun-hye, enjoyed incredible influence on the major news networks. They even handpicked the board members and presidents of these media organizations. Challenging the decade-long conservatism of these networks started actually in the alternative media. Alternative media saw a bloom during the Candlelight Revolution. And some of these, I'll just list a few, are like JTBC and Morning News. They're podcasters and YouTubers like Mangchi Buin and Media Mongu. During the corruption scandal of Park Geun-hye, while the mainstream channels maintained their support of her, and in the beginning, the alternative media were willing to show and say things that the mainstream networks wouldn't. And so during this time of people's awakening, the alternative media gained a lot of viewership. And because the Candlelight Revolution was so massive in scale, even the major networks eventually had to change their tune and become more critical of her and the government. And I'll just tell you a case study of one savvy South Korean media consumer who's my father, who's a 74-year-old Korean man. So he has like NBC or SBS or KBS on, but with the sound off. And he's got earbuds in, plugged into his iPad, and he's listening to one of these channels, one of these alternative media sources, while reclined in his massage chair as it's rolling and his eyes are closed. So he's savvy, and it just goes to show he's an example of the older generation who are interested in getting their news from other sources now to stay informed. The irony that the peace process is moving forward with Trump's involvement is not lost on South Koreans. But even some South Koreans support the idea of nominating him for the Nobel Peace Prize, as laughable as that is. Not in the sense that he deserves it, but that it could be this motivating factor for him to stick to the peace process. So remember, as Betsy said, like the US has reneged on so many agreements historically. When things were moving towards peace, the US has dropped out in these repeatedly. So this is just something that's said in the mainstream about getting him to stick to it. Also, people in South Korea no longer see the US as a generous benefactor, rather that it pursues its own interests. and perhaps this is because of Trump and his behavior. They see that the peace process is a series of negotiations between conflicting national interests, and perhaps this shifting view of the U.S. has also led to the change in popular sentiment in South Korea about North Korea itself. Now, North Korea's past provocations are understood to be bargaining tactics instead of the reckless acts of an unpredictable leader.
As for how the public narrative is being shaped up in the U.S., the dominant corporate U.S. media has focused narrowly on the issue of North Korean human rights, completely failing to recognize how the U.S. investment in ongoing war is also threatening the human rights of Koreans who should be able to live in peace. The U.S. corporate media routinely presents a biased narrative of past negotiations, constantly accusing North Korea of reneging on its promises while failing to acknowledge the U.S. provocations that have influenced the North Korean actions. And I think the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is illustrative here. Generally, the U.S. dominant media focuses on violence committed by Palestinians without any historical context of the larger structural violence of the Israeli state or a recognition that Israel is a colonial settler state. In general, it needs to be emphasized that there is no depth to mainstream U.S. media coverage. The dominant corporate media fails to provide full context when it comes to reporting on conflicts with North Korea, and the U.S. is never held accountable for its actions.
And our last question, before we open it to the audience, is how are people on the ground talking about these issues? What's happening in terms of activism, in terms of movement building, in terms of person-to-person discussion and organizing around the peace process?
So as I said earlier, North Korean society is structured very differently from what we are familiar with in the US and South Korea. I'll just share some anecdotes from some of our past KEEP trips, the Korea Education Exposure trips, where we've interacted with North Koreans and been able to talk to people about their thoughts. One, which is just a fun anecdote and just shows the different way in which they view, at least these people that we spoke to viewed society. One of our guides, we were chatting with him and we were like, oh, how did you propose to your wife? And he was like, oh, I proposed to my wife by saying, let's walk the road to revolution together. So that was their romantic proposal. And more relevant to this discussion is in 2013, our two guides we had a young student translator and another young guide, so two young women who accompanied us to the DMZ, which the trip always goes to visit, to see Panmunjom. And they had never been able to visit before, so it was a very impactful experience for them. And along with our participants, everyone sang the song "Korea is One," "조선은 하나다," and by the end, everyone was crying as they looked over at the division. And one of the youth translator said that we shouldn't cry, we shouldn't let them see our tears because then they win, right? So it was an affirming moment in the sense that the division, the sight of the division is something that causes pain and is also something that needs to be ended and fought against. So North Koreans want reunification. Pretty much everyone we speak to want the 우리 민족끼리 version of Korean reunification without U.S. interference. And as some of you may remember, shortly after Trump came into office, he enacted a travel ban to North Korea. So we are currently unable to continue the trips to North Korea, although we recently had our trip to South Korea in November 2017. And so one thing that we do want to focus on is ending the travel ban so as to allow more of this people-to-people engagement and interaction with actual people on the ground, particularly given that the narrative in the U.S. media is either demonizes North Korean people or presents them as helpless victims. And so this is a very important thing that we need to reinstate travel so as to further the peace process.
When South Korean peace activists talk about peace on the peninsula, they mean many things. Not only denuclearization of North Korea, but also denuclearization, the U.S.'s presence, their nuclear presence, the withdrawal of U.S. troops, the repeal of the national security law, which is like South Korea's version of the Patriot Act. And it also means reunification, all of these things. Peace and reunification is understood to be a process to be brought about in stages in order for it to be long-lasting and meaningful. There's kind of two main questions that South Korean grassroots organizers are addressing when it comes to the peace question. The first is how to bring what's currently mainly focused on negotiations which are between state and state level down to the people. How to center and grow the participation of the people within the process. There should be continuous engagement and cooperation between South Korea and North Korea on many levels. And we heard recently that there's plans for a soccer game between members of the labor union in South Korea and workers in North Korea, so things like that. Actually, Koreans aren't new to this idea of a multi-level approach to the engagement and cooperation between countries. From 1998 to 2008, under President Kim Dae-jung and President Roh Moo-hyun, there were many collaborative advancements made. People from the North and South, civil society, they participated in joint research, worker meetings, alternative banking systems, special economic cooperation zones, and inter-Korean railroad projects together. Longtime peace activists in South Korea see that the key to obtaining a true and permanent peace is in ensuring that the engagement between the North and South are people-centered, not state or corporate-centered. The peace process shouldn't be left in the government's hands, is what they're saying. And while most people are content watching the Moon administration make all of the efforts, our ally organizations in South Korea are doing their best to own the peace process as a people's process. The second question sort of that activists are thinking about is how to ensure that a true and permanent peace can be obtained in the long run. And as I said before, the peace process is seen as a series of stages, right? War is embedded in the laws and other systems of current South Korean society and North Korean society. The ultimate goal of the peace process is not simply to sign a treaty and be done with it. Rather, the treaty is the beginning of a systemic change, and hopefully a new paradigm of peace in Korea can take hold. So because of the fact that South Korea, the state itself developed under wartime conditions, and there's no peace treaty yet, all institutions, the state, like the military, education, legal systems, they're still based on this notion that North Korea is an enemy and that they're at war. So any peace process would have to fundamentally change those structures.
Okay, as for how the U.S. public is dealing with the peace process, it's been often noted that Americans have a limited interest in foreign affairs, and that seems much to be the case here. As time has passed since the summit, public interest seems to be fading in this issue. Among the left, there appear to be so many crises going on, whether ICE detentions and family separations or police and anti-Black violence, that it's challenging to focus issue on the Korean peace process. Within the Korean diaspora, there are mixed emotions, hope and excitement, as well as anxiety and skepticism. So it seems for the left and for the anti-war movement, this is really a critical opportunity. There needs to be a challenge to the narratives that are being constructed in Washington and by the U.S. corporate media. activists need to focus on ending the Korean War as soon as possible, even before denuclearization. And we need to work to educate the public on Korea, to connect the situation there to larger issues of U.S. militarism, and to apply pressure to the U.S. government.
Okay, thank you. Let's give a hand to Betsy, Yujin, and Rose. Thank you for that overview. I'd like to invite the other members of Nodutdol up to the front or to the orange couch for our Q&A. And I just want to mention again that what we wanted to do with this teach-in, with this presentation, was really just to begin the conversation. Obviously, we couldn't cover 70 years of history or even the intricacies of the peace process and militarism on the peninsula. So, having said that, are we ready?
Well,
Okay.
do people get a chance to write questions on Post-its? So Jun's gonna go around and collect, Minjung as well, and then Ryan will.
So, okay, our first question is, and if you need a Post-it, please raise your hand and we'll get you one. Our first question is Kim Jong-un willing to give up nuclear weapons without withdrawal of U.S. forces as a precondition? What are North Korea's objectives? Objectives. Can North Korea's objectives be achieved without the withdrawal of U.S. troops?
Are these are two different questions?
I think it's one ongoing question, but yeah, it's about the denuclearization of North Korea and the withdrawal of U.S. troops.
Is Kim Jong-un willing to give up, willing to denuclearize without withdrawal of U.S. troops? I mean, Kim Jong-il has stated in the past that it's not necessary. I think at this point, the state is saying that they are willing to consider the presence of U.S. troops. However, I would think that if the U.S. maintained its nuclear-armed, ships and things like that in South Korea, that might be problematic. Yujin, do you have any additional comments?
I mean, I think, right here?
From your mouth.
I think the idea
Just don't stand in front of the speaker.
Everyone's telling me what to do now. I don't know. So I think the issue, this question should be understood as a part of what Yujin said as a process. So do they really agree that U.S. troops will be permanently staying? That I'm not sure. And then no one will be so sure about that. However, at the time of denuclearization, do we think that U.S. is ready to leave? That really depends on, the right answer maybe depends on the political circumstances, the synergy of the different states. It depends on so many things, logically speaking. So we cannot determine, the North Korea cannot say, as an ultimate goal versus as a process and traditional goal that may be different. I think that's what we should keep in mind is that North Korea is also flexible in terms of their strategy in getting to the permanent peace.
Our next question is, how will South Korea, and I think this means the South Korean government, combat its youth's decreasing support for reunification? So, how will the South Korean government deal with the youth's decreasing support for reunification?
I think the question is about the young people in South Korea are not as interested in reunification as their, older counterparts. Actually, recently we saw a presentation in which a noted Korean author, Kim Dong-chun, spoke on this subject, and I think he also had difficulty with this question. My answer is I'm not sure how the South Korean government, but I think the question of youth engagement and reunification is a question for the left movement in South Korea, not necessarily the government. I think that will also be what mobilizing the youth in South Korea by leftist forces will also help to ensure a peace process that is more just than relying on the state to, motivate young people to care about reunification. But I think also as it becomes something that might be more tangible, it will become something that more people will be interested in. The possibility in South Korea often has seemed very remote and now not very present in everyday life.
I'm not sure that that's necessarily true though. The youth in South Korea are not interested. I have read things that perhaps they don't have this strong feeling of like a family connection and as much of the they've inherited the trauma, but they don't have a direct link to the trauma of the division. There's things like, I don't know if these are things that maybe the left will do, but for the very young, like things like being able to travel to this place that's their neighbor that they haven't been able to see, and meet their counterparts. Again, part of the people-to-people process of like perhaps bringing children together from the north and the south and getting them re-engaged, and also I think a part of the sort of systemic change that South Korean activists are looking for, which is changing the education. Like one of the sort of notion that they're at war is embedded into very early learning, and if that in itself is also shifted, then we can get a younger generation to be interested in reunification.
I just want to say one more thing on top of what Yujin said is that the result of the disinterest of the youth may be a result of the education during the 9 years. Because a lot of times when you hear about the reunification under the Park Geun-hye and Lee Myung-bak, the conservative administration, it was all about the economy. Economically, how much of tax that South Korea has to pay for, how uncommon or unequal the economic development or economic status is, so that it will be burdensome to the South Koreans. And as a young people who is looking for an employment and already having a hard time looking for a job, in terms of you are thinking about all these people who are going to be unemployed together, the reunification does not make any sense to you anymore. So then, it's not beneficial to you. And that's the propaganda of the media that made them think that this is not good for them, or this is not good for you, so you should not be really supporting. So if we think of that, then maybe the change the media and change the education will have a more balanced view on what's the benefit and what's the loss, what's the stake and what's going to be gained. Then maybe we will have a better, different youth that, after the 10 years later from now on.
How will peace talks impact travel between North and South Korea? And I assume this also means family reunification. How will these peace talks impact travel between North and South Korea?
I think the hope is that they will facilitate travel between North and South Korea, but I don't know.
There's the there's the idea of connecting the railway system so that you can travel by railway. I don't know if I can speak to like what that will look like, border control and stuff like that, but it is built into the declaration, the Minjung declaration, that there's hopes to open up this railway. And going back to the youth again, like maybe this is not the best reason why reunification is great, but I've heard a lot of people say like, oh, we can take a train all the way through Asia and go to Europe. Not that Europe shouldn't be the most desirable place, I think, but you know that there is those ideas being.
So why in this discussion isn't there more concern for the nuclear buildup in the U.S.? The mass of nuclear arms in the United States. Why isn't the denuclearization of the United States on the table?
I think that's a good question. I think it should be on the table, but you know, to speak to what Roy was mentioning earlier about the uniformity of the U.S. narrative is that whenever they talk about denuclearization, it's never mentioned. This combined with their persistent failure to commit to their own agreements that they've initiated with North Korea makes me sadly skeptical of the prospects, although it is hope. I don't know. It seems so that the amount of U.S. nuclear arms seems so huge and like something they would never give up. It's funny that the narrative is all about why can't the North Koreans give theirs up? But does anyone want?
So these are two, I think, interrelated questions. One is, in all of the talk of the nuclearization efforts in North Korea, what is the impact on the material lives of everyday people in North Korea? So the nuclear program, what is the impact on the material lives of people in North Korea? And then the second question, which is related, is how will the history of North Korea's human rights violations play into the process of reunification? And I assume this means in North Korea-US relations.
Okay, so as I said earlier, the state of war and tension on the Korean peninsula and the economic sanctions contribute to a degraded quality of life for North Koreans, and this includes the fact that a larger proportion of the national budget or whatever is allocated specifically to military needs. And North Korea themselves have stated that if they could avoid having to spend so much money on their defense, they would be able to build up their society in the way that they envisioned. There are people who say, there is the perspective that such a high proportion, by allocating such a high proportion to defense, they are doing a disservice to the people. And I think we should also look at the U.S. military budget as well in that case. But I think also the rationale, I suppose, by the North Korean government for doing so has been to defend their status as a state and to maintain a socialist lifestyle. So I think definitely for both North and South Korea, an absence of a state of war on the peninsula would allow both countries to not only to allocate more funds to the lives of everyday people. I thought that was a question. As for human rights, I think human rights, the question of human rights violations in North Korea is very complicated. When we were there most recently in 2015, they were very interested in the question of why there is so much police violence in the United States. And because we met with some traffic safety officers, and there is a different, I think that the the question of North Korean human rights is very complicated, and there is a lot of discussion, and it could be a forum in and of itself. But I think in terms of if we're going to talk about North Korean human rights violations during the negotiations, there should also be a discussion about U.S. human rights violations. But that's not going to happen.
Great, so we have time for just a couple more questions. If we don't get to your question, please feel free to bring it up in the breakout groups. And there's one statement, we'll have a little bit time for related statements at the very end of the program.
Sorry,
So,
Ryan.
yeah.
Can I just add one thing? Peace and normalized relations would allow for more transparency on both sides about the human rights. There is a lot of non-transparency. There's a lot of opacity around exactly the allegations and how they can be verified and stuff like that. And so there is a lot of uncertainty by certain scholars about the validity of claims of the degree and, varying things. And we must also remember that every nation has a prison system. So a peace process and normalized relations would allow for more transparency around these issues rather than unbridled speculation and unsubstantiated claims from either side.
Great, thank you. So we had a pair of questions about the prospects of unifying the economies of North and South Korea. One about that quote about North Korean laborers being exploitable, more or less. And then this question about assuming the two economies unify, what activists in the South might be doing to prepare for the potential economic exploitation and colonization of Northern workers by Southern businesses.
Oh, it's still back on already. I'm so used to turning it back on. I'll start off answering. So dishearteningly, but also somewhat predictably, two of the major corporations in South Korea have already done assessment studies of how to fully take advantage of, the resources of North Korea. I think it was Hyundai and Samsung, and so yes, that's unsettling and all of a sudden. But activists in South Korea are thinking about this question very deeply. So the industrial complex that is the shared industrial city, Kaesong Industrial Complex, when it was active, and this was many years ago, they blocked large corporations from taking part in it. So it was on a smaller to medium scale. And this was a place for the North Koreans and South Koreans to cooperate economically. And also North Korea is also at the table with labor unions in the South, trying to make sure that that they're not going to be taken advantage of by these larger corporations. So there is this question is definitely on the table in South Korea.
So, as most of you may know, that there is in North Korea there is a trade union, and trade union is almost like a government agency, and that a lot of people, I think, is trying to see that trade union is a government control rather than the workers' benefit. But the trade union in all the different work sites kind of work as a national committee to make sure in the Kaesong Industrial Complex when that happened, and then also in the free economic zones and free trade zones that how many of them? Kim 선생님? 22. So there are already in the US, in the North Korea, there are 22 special economic and trade zones, for the past 5 years to set up. And they, in there, the bargaining power is represented as by the trade union. And they are really firm, and they have been preparing it since 2002. They had educations and seminars from the Switzerland company consultant that we met in one of our trips. So it's not like, it's inevitable. We don't think it's inevitable. We think it's much more going to be a hard bargaining of the people to people. North Korean people are not eager to be exploited either. They are educated and they are very smart and strong people. So another thing is that's why North Korean states are not really so eager to merge the system under the reunification. When there is a discrepancy, and just like what we know of reunification comes a lot from the German model. In Germany, because of the discrepancy in economic power in the West and East Germanies, that there were a lot of problems that is happening. It's not unequal bargaining powers. So learning from that there are a lot of studies about how to maintain a separate system and then have it like, just like a currency. So, one South Korean $1 would be different from like North Korean dollars. So that to protect the North Korean and have an independent system. But there are a lot of things in the studies, but we'll see when this happens, then we'll see. And, I'm positively sure the unions and people will be able to critically view it and make sure that our voices are heard.
So our last question, oh yeah.
I just want to add that the perspective by that economist who is like, it's like South Korea without the labor unions, is a vision of reunification that's called absorption, whereas North Korea's proposal of reunification would be more of a confederated system where, as Yujin mentioned, they maintain their system. Also, an anecdote, there were these KEDO negotiations. I don't remember what KEDO stands for. KEDO? Korean Energy Development Organization, and one sticking point in the negotiations is that the U.S. and other parties wanted to hire North Korean laborers for a very low price, and the North Korea would not budge. They would not agree to their people being employed at such a low rate. So then, the people who were trying to hire them had to go elsewhere for cheaper labor. That ended up being just as expensive because they had to fly them in and do all this other stuff. So I think history has shown that at least government-wise, they're not going to just be like, okay, take everybody and don't pay them. So.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to propose we don't actually answer this last question, but just bring it into the room, because it's going to lead into our next conversation. My neighbors in Manhattan are surprised to hear that many South Koreans are actually for reconciliation and reunification. So how can we help more Americans to know about not only North Korea, but South Korea as well, South Koreans? So with that question in the air, we're going to do our breakout groups. So you're going to have an option of joining one of 3 discussions led by Yoon, Betsy, and Minjung. And I'm going to invite you 3 to just say a little bit about what you want to discuss with your group tonight.
It'll come up in the next slide. 1 second. Okay. Okay, so I will be. Yoon, do you want to, since that's the first one, do you want to do the first one? Describe the first question.
As the people in the Korean diaspora, I think
just to clarify, Yoon's discussion group will be a Korean language discussion group for those in the audience who don't feel comfortable speaking in English informally.
Or if you want to speak Korean.
Yeah, or if you want to, if you prefer.
해도 돼? That's all, I was thinking that, we have a very complex feelings about the U.S. and U.S. left movement. In a sense that, U.S. has a really deep and huge involvement or interference, intervention, or aid, however you view it, U.S. has a very strong presence in Korea's recent history. And so as a Korean diaspora living in the U.S., looking at the Korea and Korean affairs, like what are our feelings? How do we feel about and what's our goals? I think that's a complex question. It's not really simple, but I thought that maybe we can start talking about it.
So the group that I'll be meeting with, if anyone is interested, is talking about North Korea as an anti-imperialist project. So as you all know, or as you may have heard, right before the division of Korea in the Korean War in 1950 to 53, Korea was colonized by Japan, and so the establishment of North Korea, the way that we talk about it, was as like a resistance to another, yet another colonizer, basically. And that's like anti-imperialist / like a socialist an experiment in socialism. So if you want to talk about that a little bit, that's what we'll be discussing.
And then my group, I guess, will be talking about how can the discussion of peace in Korea be integrated into a discussion of progressive politics? Because as we've discussed before, there's tons of issues going on. There's the Israel-Palestine issue, there's human rights violations everywhere. And so, instead of being like, Korea is the only issue and you should do Korea issue over everything because it's the most important, we want to talk with you to figure out how we can integrate all these different issues that are a product of U.S. imperialism and U.S. power, and how we can sort of create a more unified narrative so that it's not like pockets of projects here and there, but more of a unified resistance. Should we take like a 5-minute break and then divide into groups, or should we go straight into groups?
Yeah, everyone can like that.
Yeah. Okay, so let's take 5 minutes to get into groups.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is have a quick report back from each of the 3 groups so you can hear what happened in the groups you weren't a part of. And then we're going to have time for very brief, maybe 30-second announcements from everyone in the community for related topics. So resources, events, news that's related to the peace process and Nodutdol. So do you want to start, Betsy?
Julian, where are you? You need to report back on your group as well.
I think Wu-Hae is going to report back from Julian's group.
Okay.
So we talked about as Korean Americans, our feelings for the U.S. and the U.S. The left movement, and we discussed how sometimes when we see videos about North Korea on YouTube or social media, it's kind of very sad, how demonized they are, although they're the same Koreans. And we had some of us who are conservative in Korea end up being liberals here, going to Quaker meetings and Veterans for Peace meetings, realizing that these people in the left, quote unquote, they tend to be more accepting and willing to learn about Korea. Both the right and the left has really no idea about Korea. And there is definitely a bit of difference between, different groups within the Democrats and the Schumer, Pelosi versus Bernie Sanders kind of people. And definitely both prioritize national security, but I feel like the Democrats, socialists tend to want to spend more money on U.S. healthcare and education than military, and that's probably a good thing for both Korea and the U.S. And they say that they're pro-immigrant, anti-racism, but only a few months ago we saw that some people in the left are so anti-Trump that they were against the Korean peace movement because Trump was doing that, and we were very disappointed by that. We felt betrayed, and we see some kind of hypocrisy and disconnect in their argument. They're saying like Black Lives Matter, but what about all the 75 million Korean lives in Korea? So like we want to definitely continue to like educate the left and also to talk to our conservatives among the Korean Americans to kind of, you know, just have more communication.
My group, since it's such a broad question, we didn't get time to get into like details, but some common themes that popped up in our discussion was the need for coalition building and the need for mutual education. Nodutdol's social media strategy came up as a thing, and it's something that we're working on. Also, Haejong, one of our members, pointed out the, you know, in South Korea right now, everything that they're discussing is very concrete, and so maybe as we continue to strategize and build, we need to bring more concreteness into our discussions about what we're doing. I'm sorry if I'm missing anything. Did I miss anything? I mean, I know I missed.
Well, just the stuff about the military and the militarized foreign policy.
All right, as we discuss it, the way we discuss it can be unified under the concept of a militarized foreign policy. And so organizations such as Labor Against War have done campaigns like Move the Money. And so a lot of times it's about how we talk about it. But then another participant said, you know, we've been doing education for like so long. So, but then another said that things seem to be changing. So there were no easy answers, but it was good to hear everyone's thoughts.
Besides the internet, we should have a handout for the public with that information. Question and answer type document, basic information.
Yeah, I shared in my group actually that we could really use some folks to help with condensing some of the information that you heard during the presentation today, you know, into something that's like little tidbits that we can put out to the public, either via social media or maybe in a handout. So capacity building is also important, I think, to be able to do this work and move towards true Korean peace. My group, we had some really great questions come up that I just wanted to highlight. I took really bad notes, so if anyone wants to add after I say these questions, please feel free. We were discussing North Korea as an anti-imperialist project / experiment in socialism. One question that came up that we discussed a little bit was, is North Korea practicing real socialism? Their system is working by building infrastructure and helping their people, and so like, isn't that enough? I don't know if that was quite the sentiment. Another question was, how do we get rid of the nation state without creating nation states? Did I say that right? And then there was a thought about environmental justice. Also, like, how does environmental justice and climate change kind of play into this? And we talked about like the weaponry or whatever that causes a lot of issues to the environment and nature. Another question about, is there a structure to North Korea's anti-imperialist project? So like, what, you know, is there in the example of the Philippines, who we have a lot to share with, I think, as Koreans, was given about like the structure that exists there. And that was a question that I wasn't really able to answer. And the last one I just want to highlight is, how do we talk about reunification with community? So like, you know, with the left, with friends, with people who are talking about the news cycle, and stuff like that, because it's hard to break down, right? A 70-year history with various folks. So are there other things that folks wanted to highlight from my group? I really hate reporting back, actually. So thanks, Brian.
Okay, thank you all. Quick community announcements. Announcements from the community.
I'm Michael Zweig from the U.S. Labor Against the War, and I just wanted to bring to this meeting the results of resolution that U.S. Labor Against the War brought to the American Federation of Teachers. That's a union of 1,750,000 people around the country. We just had our national convention in Pittsburgh, and through one of our locals, we have about 25 locals affiliated with U.S. Labor Against the War just in AFT. This passed. Whereas the United States government has a key role to play in securing a stable peace on the Korean Peninsula, and whereas the American Federation of Teachers wishes to stand in solidarity with the people of South Korea and the unions and workers of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, resolved that the American Federation of Teachers recognizes the right of the Korean people in both North and South Korea to determine together the conditions for peace and security on the Korean Peninsula. Resolved that the AFT calls upon the government of the United States to respect the peace process now underway between the governments of North and South Korea, and to contribute to it by recognizing that the shape of peace and development on the Korean Peninsula is a matter for the Korean people to decide. B, declaring that it will not engage in a first strike military action on the Korean Peninsula. C, declaring that it has no interest in fomenting regime change on the Korean Peninsula. Also declaring that with regard to the deployment of U.S. military forces, including the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Missile System, that's THAAD, now in early and highly contested stages of construction in South Korea, the United States will respect the wishes of the Korean people, including with, should they demand it, fully withdrawing U.S. military forces from the peninsula, and refraining from any activity that would sabotage the peace process among the Korean people while negotiating in good faith a peace treaty with North Korea. And resolved that the AFT will forward this resolution to the President of the United States and his Secretary of State, as well as to the appropriate congressional and Senate leaders, and to U.S. Labor Against the War for circulation in the labor movement in the United States and South Korea. That passed the convention, not just the International Committee, but it was declared a priority, and it was sent to the entire convention and passed. So we are happy to say that we have been able to get, at least in the teachers union, some traction for this, and I would encourage everybody to take a resolution like this to your organization and work with the Korean community here in the United States and in Korea to advance the American contribution to this whole peace process the way we're trying to do it.
Thanks so much. Other announcements, resources, news to share?
I thought this was a very interesting discussion. The militant newspaper, the newspaper of the Socialist Workers' Party since the 50s have opposed the division of Korea. And we published a little history of the Korean War, which is actually downloadable off the website, which people could use as a resource. We take it door to door in working class communities of all different nationalities, and we found, as people have said, growing interest in this because the workers in the U.S. don't want to go to war. And so that's one suggestion. And there's been a lot of discussion on the Trump. I liked what was said about the people that are hysterical over Trump, and then so that now they're attacking Korea because he's negotiating. But if you want to understand more of the Trump phenomena, there's a book here called The Clinton's Anti-Working Class Record, which I have copies of. I think it's the best book to understand why he won, but also what that means for the opportunities for us to get out the side of the working class and to oppose what U.S. imperialism is doing around the world. That's it.
Others? Oh.
Yep.
Michael Garavillas with Not Bayan New York, the Filipino youth organization fighting for national democracy back home in the Philippines. So I have a lot of announcements, but one I'll really point out is on Monday, July 30th, we're actually having an educational discussion on SICA, or Social Investigation Class Analysis, and especially linking up with what y'all have already mentioned, right? To really build a coalition, but to understand, right, through SICA, how we can discuss amongst our members, but also our communities, right? To discuss whether it be for our organization, or even as Nodutdol, or even other people's organizations, or as general members of the community, right? To talk about politics, anti-imperialist politics, Korean diaspora politics, right? Because without knowing or having a sharp analysis, how can we really truly guide the people for what is right, for what is genuinely right and free for the people, right? So that's Monday, July 30th. I'll be here to give you more information. But yes, thank you. Oh, that's why you have to come to me. Location, right?
Thank you. Last call.
Hi, my name is Maureen. There's two related things coming up. Someone mentioned Palestine and the connection to Palestine. So I have some flyers if you're interested on Thursday, August 2nd at 7 o'clock at the Barnard Diana Center, room 504. I have some flyers. There is going to be a discussion called Breaking Bars, Fighting Incarceration from the U.S. to Palestine. And 3 organizations are sponsoring that. We were asked, actually, Adamir, anti-incarceration group in Palestine, Releasing Aging in Palestine, asked to do this with some U.S. groups. Releasing Aging People from Prison in the U.S. and Jewish Voice for Peace are putting this on. The other thing is we know incarceration is related to intersections of our issues. August 9th, right here at the Asian American Writers Workshop are hosting us. They're really generous in giving the space to Survived and Punished. We're having an event here August 9th called Free Them All. It's part of a national week of action. And we're going to be pressuring Como to free criminalized survivors of gender violence as we work to free everybody from prison. So I hope some of you come because it's going to be really exciting. So thank you.
I have one more. Sorry. If you want to continue kind of like working on some Korea Peace stuff and work on the inside strategy, there's a small group of folks who have been starting to work on targeting, not Como, the other jerk, Schumer, for his like horrendous letter alongside a bunch of other Senate Democrats or whatever to Trump, saying basically like making it really difficult to get towards Korean peace. So come talk to me if you want to learn more about getting involved in either a very small way or in a bigger role.
And just one final, there's a sign-up sheet in the back table over there. So if you are not yet signed up to our mailing list and would like to be informed of future events and possible follow-ups to this one, make sure to sign up over there.
JT, could you go to the last slide? So on August 12th, Nodutdol is going to be part of a peace walk in Flushing, Sunday, August 12th. So talk to Yujin or email us if you're interested in marching for peace with Nodutdol. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you for coming. Actually, I just want to make sure that you all have seen our merchandise table. Tammy, can you show a T-shirt that is for the Peace March T-shirts? That's the Peace March T-shirt. So on August 12th, about 100 or 200 people will be wearing the same T-shirts, and we are trying to march on the Logan Boulevard, like calling for peace and action in the U.S. and trying to promote that there are people who really want and supports the peace process. So if you want to come out on that Sunday, it's gonna be fun, and there will be a lot of fun activities also, and family friendly supposed to be, and kids and dogs and how anybody if you are in the spirit. Okay, we have to take a picture.
Right.
Proliferate peace and unlearn war. Maybe under that. Still. Don't move. This is panorama.
Yeah, panorama. Okay. It's really big.
Thank you.